Some secrets don't begin with a kiss. Sometimes they begin with a promise you make to yourself that you'll never tell anyone what really happened. I told myself that story for 3 years, and even now, I still don't know if I left that ranch with a secret or if the secret followed me home. When my best friend Caleb Walker invited me to spend the summer at his family's ranch in western Montana after our junior year of college, it sounded like exactly what I needed. I had spent the previous semester buried under deadlines, student loans, and the constant pressure of pretending I had my future figured out. Caleb laughed when I admitted I'd never driven a tractor, never repaired a fence, and had only seen horses up close at county fairs. He told me not to worry because everyone was useless during their first week anyway. That was Caleb. He had a way of making people believe they belonged before they actually did. Caleb had dated girls for as long as I had known him, so I had never once allowed myself to imagine he could look at me differently. The Walker Ranch sat nearly 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by rolling hills that seemed to stretch forever beneath enormous blue skies. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my tires as I pulled in with everything I owned for the summer packed into the back of my aging SUV. Before I even turned off the engine, Caleb jogged across the yard wearing faded jeans, worn cowboy boots, and a sun-bleached denim shirt with the sleeves rolled above his forearms. He looked exactly like someone who had grown up working outdoors his entire life, broad-shouldered, confident, and completely at home beneath the July sun. He grinned the second he saw me, pulled me into one of those quick one-armed hugs that guys rarely think twice about, and said, "About time, city boy." I laughed because that's what I always did around him. His parents welcomed me like another son. His mom insisted I call her Linda instead of Mrs. Walker, and his dad handed me a glass of sweet tea before asking if I minded getting up before sunrise. Their kindness felt effortless, the kind that couldn't be faked. Dinner that evening stretched for nearly 2 hours around a weathered oak table filled with stories, homemade food, and the easy rhythm of a family that genuinely enjoyed being together. I realized how different it felt from the quiet apartment where I had grown up, where everyone loved each other but rarely knew how to say it out loud. After dinner, Caleb showed me the small guest room overlooking the north pasture. Through the open window came the sounds of crickets, distant cattle, and the warm summer breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut hay. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced for years. I remember thinking that maybe the summer would simply be about slowing down, helping around the ranch, and making memories with my oldest friend before real adulthood pulled us in different directions. If someone had told me then that those 12 weeks would quietly reshape everything I believed about friendship, identity, and the future I thought I wanted, I would have laughed. Instead, I unpacked my suitcase, set my camera on the windowsill, and watched Caleb disappear across the pasture with the last light of day painting the horizon gold. Just before I closed the curtains, I noticed him stop beside the old fence line, glance back toward my window as if he wanted to say something, then slowly turn away without a word, leaving me with the strange feeling that the summer had already begun changing both of us before either of us understood why. The ranch woke before the sun, and by the end of my second morning I understood why Caleb had laughed when I called it a summer vacation. At 5:30, the kitchen lights were already glowing. Linda had coffee brewing, fresh biscuits cooling on the counter, and a country radio station humming softly in the background. Caleb tossed me a pair of leatherwork gloves before I had even finished breakfast. He grinned when he noticed me studying the schedule his father had scribbled on a legal pad. "Around here," he said, "the cows do not care if you stayed up late." Every day settled into a rhythm that somehow felt both exhausting and peaceful. We repaired loose fence posts, stacked square bales of hay in the old red barn, cleaned horse stalls, checked water troughs, and drove across endless pastures in a dusty pickup that rattled every time we crossed a cattle guard. My shoulders ached, my hands collected blisters beneath the gloves, and my boots were permanently covered in dirt. Yet every evening I felt more accomplished than I had after months spent sitting in college lecture halls. Caleb never treated me like someone who did not belong. Whenever I struggled with a task, he demonstrated it once, handed me the tools, and trusted me to figure out the rest. That quiet confidence made me want to become better, not because I needed to impress him, but because I hated disappointing someone who believed in me so easily. One afternoon, we spent nearly 3 hours repairing a stretch of fencing along the north pasture. The July heat shimmered above the grass while meadowlarks sang from the fence posts. We worked mostly in comfortable silence until Caleb suddenly looked toward me and said, "You know, Dad likes you." I laughed. "I hope so. I have only broken one shovel so far." Caleb shook his head. "That is not what I meant." His expression lingered for a second longer than usual before he drove another staple into the fence. I waited for him to explain, but he only smiled and changed the subject, asking whether I wanted burgers or barbecue for dinner. For some reason, his unfinished sentence stayed with me long after we climbed back into the truck. That evening, after everyone had gone inside, I wandered toward the horse pasture with my camera. The sunset painted the sky in deep shades of orange and lavender, while the horses grazed quietly beneath the cottonwood trees. I raised the camera just as Caleb stepped into the frame, unaware I was there. He rested both forearms across the top rail of the fence and watched the horizon without saying a word. There was something unusually thoughtful about him, as if the silence itself was keeping him company. Before I could lower the camera, he turned unexpectedly and caught me looking. Instead of teasing me, he simply smiled, almost shyly, then asked, "Did you get a good picture?" I nodded, although I had forgotten to press the shutter. He walked over, glanced at the blank camera screen, and laughed so hard he nearly doubled over. I laughed too, but my face felt strangely warm. Later that night, while I copied the day's photos onto my laptop, I noticed something odd. Mixed among my pictures was one I did not remember taking. It showed me standing beside the barn that morning, smiling while I talked with Linda, completely unaware the photo existed. There was only one person who could have taken it, and when I looked out the guest room window, I saw Caleb sitting alone on the porch swing, staring into the darkness with my camera strap still hanging over his shoulder. By the third week, the ranch no longer felt like a place I was visiting. It felt like a place that quietly expected me every morning. I knew which gate always stuck after a humid night, which horse would nudge my shoulder in search of an extra apple, and exactly where the morning sunlight spilled across the porch steps while Linda watered her flower boxes. Without realizing it, I had begun measuring time by chores instead of calendar dates. Caleb noticed the change before I did. "You stopped checking your phone every 10 minutes. He teased one afternoon as we loaded feed into the back of the truck. I pulled my phone from my pocket and realized he was right. The battery had almost died because I had forgotten to charge it for 2 days. "I guess there is not much to miss out here," I answered. He smiled without looking at me. "Maybe there is more to find instead." His words settled somewhere in my mind long after the conversation ended. A few days later, we rode horseback to inspect the western pasture after one of the neighboring ranchers mentioned a damaged section of fencing. The ride took nearly an hour beneath a cloudless sky, and the farther we traveled, the quieter everything became. There were no highways, no phone service, no distant sounds except wind moving through tall grass and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. Caleb looked completely different on horseback. Every movement came naturally, as though horse and rider understood each other without needing commands. Watching him laugh as his horse splashed through a shallow creek, I caught myself smiling, before I even realized why. Then he looked over his shoulder and caught me again. "What?" he asked with an amused grin. Quickly shook my head. "Nothing." He narrowed his eyes playfully. "That is twice this week you have been looking at me like you are trying to solve a mystery." My heart skipped so unexpectedly that I almost lost my balance in the saddle. Before I could think of a believable answer, a startled deer darted from the trees and disappeared across the meadow, breaking the moment as quickly as it had arrived. Caleb laughed and pointed after it, completely unaware that something else had nearly escaped at the same time. That evening, a group of neighbors gathered at the ranch for a casual barbecue, bringing homemade pies, folding chairs, and enough stories to last until well after sunset. Everyone seemed to know everyone else, and every conversation drifted naturally from weather to football to cattle prices. Several girls around our age smiled at Caleb throughout the evening, and one of them, a cheerful blonde named Emily, asked if he... The weather changed without much warning, just like people sometimes do. The morning had begun with bright sunshine and a sky so clear it seemed impossible that rain could be anywhere nearby. By early afternoon, dark clouds rolled over the mountains, swallowing the blue one layer at a time. Caleb looked toward the western horizon while we finished checking fence posts along the far edge of the property. "We need to head for the line cabin," he said, pointing toward a small wooden structure sitting alone nearly half a mile away. "That storm is moving faster than it looks." We urged the horses into a steady trot, but before we reached the cabin, fat drops of rain began falling across the pasture. Within minutes, the summer shower transformed into a steady downpour that blurred the hills into soft gray shapes. By the time we tied the horses beneath the cabin shelter, both of us were soaked despite our jackets. The cabin itself was simple, built decades earlier for ranch hands working the distant grazing fields. Inside stood a cast-iron stove, 2 wooden chairs, a narrow table, shelves stocked with emergency supplies, and a pair of old bunk beds that looked as though they had not changed in 50 years. Caleb laughed while shaking rainwater from his hat. "Well, I guess we are not making it back anytime soon." I looked through the rain-covered window. The gravel road had completely disappeared beneath sheets of water. "Your dad will worry." Caleb pulled an old handheld radio from a shelf and managed to reach the ranch after several attempts. "We are staying at the line cabin until it passes," he told his father calmly. "Everything is fine." Hearing those words somehow settled my own nerves. We spent the next hour making hot coffee on the little propane stove and watching the storm roll across the valley. Rain drummed steadily against the tin roof while occasional thunder echoed somewhere beyond the hills. It was surprisingly peaceful. At one point Caleb noticed me staring out the window and quietly asked, "What are you thinking about?" I smiled without taking my eyes off the rain. "Honestly, I do not remember the last time I sat still long enough to watch a storm." He leaned against the windowsill beside me. "Maybe that is why people come out here. Eventually the ranch teaches you that not every minute has to be filled." His shoulder brushed mine for only a second as both of us shifted to look outside. Yet neither of us stepped away. The silence that followed felt different from any we had shared before. Comfortable but somehow heavier, as if both of us sensed a conversation waiting just beneath the surface. Then Caleb quietly broke it. "Can I ask you something?" I turned toward him. He hesitated long enough to make me wonder if he had changed his mind. "Have you ever been afraid that everyone expects you to become someone you are not?" The question surprised me because it sounded nothing like the confident friend I had known for years. "Sometimes," I admitted. "More often than I like to admit." He nodded slowly, staring into his untouched coffee mug. "Yeah, me too." Before I could ask what he meant, another loud clap of thunder rattled the cabin, and he stood abruptly, pretending to organize supplies that clearly did not need organizing. Whatever he had almost said disappeared with the moment. As evening approached, the rain finally softened into a gentle drizzle. The sky beyond the window glowed with the fading colors of sunset, and Caleb stepped onto the porch to check on the horses. I followed a minute later and found him standing perfectly still, watching a rainbow stretch across the valley. Without looking at me, he quietly said, "There is something I have never told anyone." My heart began pounding before he even continued. But just as he opened his mouth again, the radio inside the cabin suddenly crackled to life with his father's voice calling our names, and whatever confession had been waiting between us vanished into the sound of static. SUA life on the ranch settled back into its familiar rhythm after the storm, but something invisible had shifted between Caleb and me. Nothing dramatic happened. We still laughed over burned pancakes when breakfast ran late, argued playfully about the fastest way to mend a broken fence, and spent long afternoons checking cattle beneath the relentless Montana sun. To anyone watching, we looked exactly like 2 lifelong friends enjoying one last carefree summer before returning to college. The only difference was that I had started noticing the spaces between our conversations almost as much as the conversations themselves. Caleb seemed to stop himself before finishing certain thoughts, as though he was quietly editing every sentence before letting it leave his mouth. I found myself doing the same thing. The words I wanted to say never sounded safe enough once they reached the edge of my lips. One Saturday morning, Linda asked us to drive into town for supplies before the county fair began filling every store with visitors. The small downtown was decorated with red, white, and blue banners left over from Independence Day, and families wandered between antique shops, bakeries, and the local feed store. While Caleb loaded bags of livestock feed into the truck, I slipped into a small bookstore across the street. I found an old photography collection featuring landscapes from the American West and stood flipping through the pages until I heard someone behind me say, "You must be Ethan." I turned to see Emily smiling warmly. She introduced herself again, then admitted she had recognized me from the barbecue at the ranch. We chatted comfortably for several minutes about school, photography, and how quickly summer always seemed to disappear. Before leaving, she smiled and said, "I hope I see you both at the fair dance next weekend." I smiled politely, but before I could answer, I noticed Caleb standing outside the bookstore window. He was not angry. He simply watched us with an expression I had never seen before, one that disappeared the instant our eyes met. During the drive home, the truck felt unusually quiet. Finally, I asked, "Everything all right?" Caleb kept his attention on the road. "Yeah." A few miles passed before he added, almost too casually, "Emily seems nice." "She does." Another silence settled between us. Then he surprised me by asking, "Would you date someone like her?" I laughed softly, buying myself a few extra seconds. "I have not really thought about it." He nodded once, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter before changing the subject to football season as though the question had never been asked. That night, after dinner, I sat alone on the back porch editing photographs while the sky slowly filled with stars. Caleb eventually joined. The days leading up to the county fair slipped past with the strange feeling that summer had quietly reached the point where every ordinary moment suddenly seemed important. I found myself paying attention to little things I knew I would probably miss once I returned home. The sound of Caleb whistling while repairing a saddle. The way Linda always left an extra cinnamon roll on the counter because she knew I woke up hungry after morning chores. The familiar creak of the porch swing every evening as the sun disappeared behind the hills. None of those moments seemed remarkable on their own, yet together they had become a life I was not ready to leave. Caleb, however, had grown noticeably quieter. He still smiled, still joked with his parents, and still worked beside me from sunrise until dinner, but every now and then I caught him staring into the distance with the same thoughtful expression I had first noticed weeks earlier. It was as if he were trying to solve a question that refused to give him an answer. The county fair finally arrived on a warm Saturday evening. The fairgrounds buzzed with families, children carrying oversized stuffed animals, the smell of barbecue drifting through the air, and live country music echoing across the midway. Caleb insisted we try every ridiculous game even though neither of us was particularly good at them. After missing nearly every ring toss, I somehow won a small stuffed horse with my last throw. Laughing, I handed it to him. "There," I said. "Now you have proof that miracles happen." He looked down at the toy, then back at me with an expression so unexpectedly gentle that my smile almost disappeared. "I think I will keep this one," he said quietly. For reasons I could not explain, those simple words stayed with me longer than they should have. Later, while we wandered past the livestock barns, we heard someone calling Caleb's name. Emily walked over with two friends, cheerful as always. She asked whether he wanted to join them for the dance that would begin after sunset. Caleb hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. Then he glanced toward me before answering. "Maybe later," he said politely. Emily smiled, although disappointment briefly crossed her face before she wished us a good evening and walked away. I pretended not to think about the fact that he had looked at me before giving his answer, but the moment repeated itself in my mind for the rest of the night. As darkness settled over the fairgrounds, fireworks began lighting the sky above the rodeo arena. People gathered on a grassy hill overlooking the displays, and Caleb and I found a quiet spot away from the crowd. We sat shoulder to shoulder without speaking, watching colors bloom above us before fading into the stars. Halfway through the show, Caleb quietly asked, "Do you ever wish time would just stop for a while?" I looked toward him instead of the fireworks. Only when I know something good is about to end. He slowly nodded, his eyes never leaving the sky. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, almost absent-mindedly, our hands brushed against each other on the grass. Neither of us pulled away immediately. My heartbeat became so loud I wondered if he could hear it. After the conversation ended there, hanging in the cool night air between us like something too fragile to touch. Caleb walked into the house without another word, and I remained beside the truck for several minutes, staring at the porch light glowing against the darkness. I knew he had been trying to tell me something important, yet I also understood why he stopped. The answer he was searching for could change everything, and neither of us seemed ready to discover what came after it. The next morning arrived with the quiet certainty that summer was running out. My calendar reminded me that I had less than 2 weeks before I needed to drive back home for the start of the fall semester. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, I found myself counting how many sunrises were left instead of how many had already passed. Every chore suddenly carried an unexpected weight because I realized I might never experience these ordinary moments in quite the same way again. Caleb noticed my packed notebook sitting on the kitchen table beside a printed class schedule. He looked at it for a second before asking, "So it is really almost time?" I nodded. "Yeah, I have to leave next Friday." He forced a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. That came fast. Neither of us mentioned it again during breakfast, but the thought followed us through the entire day. That afternoon we rode out to move a small group of cattle into a different pasture before the weather turned hotter later in the week. The work required patience more than speed, and hours passed with only occasional conversations drifting between us. At one point we stopped beneath a large cottonwood tree to drink water and rest the horses. Caleb sat beside me in the shade, absently skipping small stones across a shallow creek. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Anything," I answered. He watched another stone disappear beneath the water before speaking again. If someone realized they had been wrong about themselves for a long time, would it make them a different person? I took my time before answering because I knew this question mattered more than the others. "I think it would just make them a more honest one." Caleb lowered his head, and for a brief moment I thought he might finally say everything he had been carrying. Instead, he smiled to himself, almost sadly, and whispered, "I wish believing that were easier." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than usual, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt like both of us were slowly walking toward the same door without knowing who would be brave enough to open it first. That evening Linda asked if I would help her organize old family photo albums before dinner. We spread dozens of faded photographs across the dining room table. There were pictures of Caleb as a little boy learning to ride horses, family Christmas mornings, county fairs, and high school football games. Then Linda handed me an envelope tucked inside one of the albums. "Those are the pictures Caleb took this summer," she said with a warm smile. "He has been carrying that camera everywhere because of you." Curious, I opened the envelope and slowly flipped through the prints. There were landscapes, horses, sunsets, and candid photographs of everyone around the ranch. But what caught me completely off guard was that nearly every other picture was of me. Me repairing fences, me laughing with his father, me carrying hay, me standing on the porch at sunrise, me watching the stars without realizing anyone was watching me. I looked up at Linda in surprise, but she had already stepped into the kitchen. Just then the front door opened, and I heard Caleb's boots crossing the wooden floor. He froze the instant he saw the photographs spread across the table, and the expression on his face told me he had never intended for me to discover how often he had quietly been seeing the summer through my eyes. The house felt unusually quiet after Caleb saw the photographs spread across the dining room table. For a long second, neither of us spoke. He looked from the pictures to me, then slowly rubbed the back of his neck, an old habit he always fell into whenever he felt uncomfortable. "I was going to show you those eventually," he said with an awkward laugh that sounded nothing like his usual confident one. I picked up one of the prints. It was the picture of me standing beside the horse pasture during sunrise, completely unaware that anyone had been watching. "You took all of these?" I asked. He nodded. "I guess I did." "Why?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Caleb looked down at the wooden floor for several seconds before quietly answering. Because every time I looked through the camera, you were usually the best thing in front of it. My heart stumbled over itself. It would have been so easy to ask him exactly what he meant. But fear has a strange way of disguising itself as patience. Before either of us could continue, Linda cheerfully called us into the kitchen for dinner, breaking the moment just as naturally as every other interruption that Summer seemed to do. The conversation never returned that evening. Instead, we laughed with his parents, talked about the weather, and planned the next morning's work as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet every glance between Caleb and me carried the weight of unfinished sentences. A few days later, my packed suitcase appeared beside the guest room door. Seeing it there made everything feel real in a way that calendars never could. The ranch no longer felt endless. Every remaining day suddenly seemed far too short. Caleb suggested that we spend one last afternoon riding to the overlook above the Western Valley before I left. It had become our favorite place over the summer, a quiet ridge where the entire ranch stretched below like a painting. We saddled the horses after lunch and reached the hill just as the late afternoon sun began turning the fields golden. We sat in the grass without speaking for several minutes, letting the breeze move through the tall prairie grass around us. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "Do you remember what I asked you in the line cabin?" I nodded. "You asked whether people could spend years trying to become someone everyone expected them to be." He smiled faintly. I think I already knew the answer back then. I just was not ready to hear myself say it. I looked at him carefully, sensing that this time he might actually finish the conversation that had been following us all summer. He took a slow breath and continued. "When you first came here, I thought I was just happy my best friend was spending the summer with us. Then somewhere along the way, everything started feeling different. I kept trying to explain it away. I told myself I was just worried because you would be leaving soon, but it never really felt that simple." The words settled gently between us, honest and unforced. I felt my own heartbeat quicken as I quietly admitted, "It did not feel simple for me either." Caleb turned toward me, surprise and relief crossing his face at exactly the same time. Neither of us rushed the moment. We simply sat there smiling in quiet disbelief, as though both of us had finally stopped pretending not to understand what had been growing between us for weeks. The sun dipped lower, painting the valley in amber light, and for the first time all summer the silence no longer felt uncertain, felt peaceful. As we stood to leave, Caleb reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and carefully handed me a folded envelope. "Do not open it until after you leave," he said softly. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. "Promise me." I slipped it into my backpack without asking another question, never imagining that the words waiting inside would become the secret I carried away from the ranch for years. The morning I left arrived far too quietly. The sunrise painted the pastures with the same golden light that had greeted me on my first day. Yet everything felt different because now every familiar sight carried the weight of goodbye. Linda packed enough homemade cookies to feed me for a week, insisting that college students never ate properly. Mr. Walker shook my hand before pulling me into a brief hug and telling me there would always be a place for me at the ranch. I thanked them both, knowing that no words could fully express what their kindness had meant to me. Caleb helped me load my suitcase into the back of my SUV, but neither of us seemed able to find the right conversation. We talked about classes, football season, and whether the old truck would survive another winter, carefully avoiding the only subject that mattered. Before I climbed into the driver's seat, he reached out and squeezed my shoulder. "Drive safe," he said softly. I nodded because I knew that if I tried to say anything more, I might not leave at all. As the ranch disappeared in my rearview mirror, I reached into my backpack and found the envelope he had asked me not to open until I had gone. I pulled onto a quiet roadside overlook nearly 20 miles away, turned off the engine, and finally unfolded the letter. His handwriting was unmistakable, steady but deeply personal. He wrote that before that summer he had believed his entire life had already been planned. He had assumed he understood exactly who he was and what his future would look like. Then I had arrived, and without trying to change him, I had quietly changed everything. He admitted that he still did not have every answer and that he was scared of what those answers might mean. I think I'm in love with you. I'm not ready for anyone else to know. Maybe I'm not even ready to say it out loud. But there was one thing he knew with complete certainty. He had never missed anyone before they had even left until that summer. He ended the letter with a single sentence that I read over and over until the words blurred together. If this is only the beginning of my truth, I hope someday it leads me back to you. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my wallet, where it remained every single day afterward. That was the secret I carried home. It was never something dramatic or impossible. It was simply the quiet knowledge that two people had found something real before either of them was fully ready to understand it. 3 years passed. We finished college in different states, built careers, and stayed in touch through birthdays, holidays, and occasional phone calls that always seemed too short. Neither of us ever mentioned the letter, but neither of us pretended it had never existed. Then one October afternoon my phone rang while I was editing photographs in my apartment. Caleb's name appeared on the screen. The moment I answered, I recognized the calm confidence in his voice. I have been thinking about that summer again, he said. I smiled before answering because I already knew exactly which summer he meant. Me too. He laughed softly. I finally stopped trying to become the person I thought everyone expected me to be. My heart quietly remembered every unfinished conversation beneath Montana sunsets, every photograph, every silence, and every moment that had led us here. I am coming to see you this weekend, he continued. This time I do not want to leave anything unsaid. When I hung up the phone, I reached into my wallet and unfolded the weathered letter one more time. For years I believed the secret I had taken with me was loving my best friend without knowing what the future could hold. I eventually realized the real secret was hope, because sometimes the most important journeys do not begin when you arrive somewhere new. Sometimes they begin the moment you finally find the courage to return.